Hey viewers, welcome back to our channel, TalkStream English, and another great video to boost your speaking skills. Hope this episode will helpful for all of you. So let's start. Jane and Alice's conversation about common mistakes in speaking English. Jane: this cafe is lovely. I love the ambience here. The coffee is great too. Alice: absolutely. It's one of my favorite spots. By the way, Jane, I've been meaning to ask you about something. You've been teaching English for a while now, right? Jane: yes, it's been about 5 years. Why do you ask? Alice: well, I've been trying to improve my English, and I keep stumbling over certain mistakes. I was hoping you could shed some light on common errors people make when speaking English. Jane: of course, I'd be happy to help. English can be tricky, especially with all its exceptions and irregularities. What kind of mistakes are you running into? Alice: there are quite a few actually. For starters, I often get confused with articles, like when to use a, an, and the. Jane: that's a very common issue. The key is understanding when to use definite and indefinite articles. A and an are indefinite articles, used when referring to a non-specific item. The is a definite article, used for something specific. For example, you'd say, I saw a dog, when it's any dog, but I saw the dog, if it's a specific dog you've talked about before. Alice: that makes sense. But what about the difference between a and an? Jane: good question. Use a before words that start with a consonant sound and an before words that start with a vowel sound. For instance, a book and an apple. It's the sound that matters, not necessarily the letter. So you'd say an hour because the H is silent, making the vowel sound dominant. Alice: oh, I see. I always thought it was just the first letter that determined it. That clarifies a lot. Another thing I struggle with is prepositions. They seem so random sometimes. Jane: prepositions can be really tricky because they don't always translate directly between languages. The best way to get a handle on them is through practice and exposure. For example, we say interested in, not interested on, or interested at. Similarly, we use on the bus, but in a car. It's just a matter of usage patterns. Alice: it sounds like a lot of memorization. Jane: to some extent, yes. But over time, with enough reading, listening, and speaking, you start to get a feel for what sounds right. Also, idiomatic expressions in English can be quite confusing. For instance, saying someone is on cloud 9 means they're very happy, which isn't intuitive at all if you're not familiar with the idiom. Alice: definitely. I remember the first time I heard kick the bucket. I was so confused. I thought it had something to do with literally kicking a bucket. Jane: that's a great example. Idioms and phrasal verbs can trip up even advanced learners. Phrasal verbs like give up, take off, and look forward to are particularly confusing because their meanings aren't always obvious from the individual words. Alice: yes, phrasal verbs are another headache. Sometimes I know the words separately, but together they mean something entirely different. Jane: exactly. Look up can mean to literally look at something above you, but it can also mean to search for information. Context is key. Another common mistake is confusing words that sound similar but have different meanings, like there, and there. Alice: oh, those are the worst. I always mix them up when writing. Any tips on how to remember the differences? Jane: sure. There is possessive, so think of it as belonging to them. There is used for location, like over there, and there is a contraction of they are. Breaking them down and using them in sentences helps a lot. For example, their car is over there. They're going to pick it up. Alice: I'll have to practice that. Another thing I've noticed is that sometimes I use the wrong tense. English tenses seem more complicated than in my native language. Jane: tenses can be complex because English has so many of them, and they all convey slightly different meanings. It's important to understand the context. For instance, the simple present tense is used for habitual actions, like I eat breakfast every day, while the present continuous tense is for actions happening right now, like I am eating breakfast, Alice. And the past tense is another area where I stumble, especially with irregular verbs, Jane. Irregular verbs are tricky because they don't follow standard rules. There's no shortcut other than memorization and practice. For example, go becomes went, not goed. One tip is to read a lot, as seeing these verbs in context repeatedly will help solidify them in your memory. Alice, I'll definitely try to read more. Speaking of verbs, I also get confused with modal verbs like can, could, should, and would.